So tomorrow,
I don't know, but I want to be the
I'm not comfortable. So tomorrow, so this is what I would like. All of you to be here before 5.
Okay.
Deal.
first series.
So lobby assignment first, and if you could be here, who could be here 3rd? Anybody? Do you think so?
We just all have.
No, you can still come first, I know, but if you can't come first, we'll pack in. 3rd, 4th. It's really good.
I'm gonna be here.
Okay, me too. And 4th, so if no one's there, the only reason is I can get other stuff done 5th, and if we get everyone done before 5th, that's me being purely 100% selfish. And so, but I will collect that practice test then on Thursday, and then remember Sunday, we'll have a review session, and on Sunday, I will go in depth over probably the first about, let's talk about either the end of it or the beginning of it. But I'm going to split it in half and go in depth over as many things as possible on the review sheet as I can go through, and also give you a couple other things. And that will be on Sunday at what time? And then what time on Wednesday? And then I will do then, since we got kind of messed up with the Honor Society and people weren't sure about it, on Monday at lunch, I will go through that last page. I'll get as much done as we can on that last page one day. Even though you're responsible, I will help you out with that. The other days at lunch, I'll go through any of the section we just want to be sure about or any other part of the test. I'll do that at lunch too. And then that will be the review. That practice test will be, you have to have it done tomorrow. And I have another one for you, but this one I'm just going to give to you. You can just keep it and do what you want. It's just another practice test. And what else? Oh, and then the brainstorm outline and thesis on Monday. And remember, that will be on colonial economies by the northern and southern economies. Sound good? Just 5 minutes, last little bit of review. Gosh, and then the test is just over a week away. How many have a test next week besides AP US History? Next week. How about the week after? AP test. Well, I mean just AP test. Not just any test. Isn't that exciting? You got lots of tests. See, you're branching out. Will you tell her what classes
She said you said yes.
When? Really? This year? They were doing it this year? Oh, now she's going to be mad at me. Thanks a lot. Well, you're lucky she didn't throw them away. Somebody, namely, why are people walking around out there? But namely me might get so irritated I might throw them away. I get mad. So I don't blame her. Who did it? Who was working on it? Wow! They turned on you. What a bunch of snitches. All right, so let's go take your notes out. And okay, so I will get donuts, but I don't know how we'll have enough. You might have to fight over them. My plan is I'm going to put 2 donuts in the middle and just you go at it.
I don't like donuts.
You don't like donuts? I'm getting the good kind of donuts. I like the really savory donuts, a lot of salt. Just deep fat fried dough with lots of salt. That's what I like. You know the scary thing about what's deep fat fried is probably, we're humans, you probably like it. We just get deep fat fried sticks of butter. Okay, so. No, actually, you can buy them. That's a carnival food. A stick of butter, deep fat fried on a stick. I'm not making that up. Yeah, that's called heart attack on a stick. All right. So, what was the plan from Cuba, or to invade Cuba, and it fails? No, Mongoose was to kill Castro. What do we call it? The Bay of Pigs. They would have the first televised what in 1960? And who looked like a sinister chipmunk? And he would always look like, I mean, you got to admit, that's chipmunk looking.
He was hilarious.
Huh?
He was hilarious.
Nixon?
Yes, he was funny. I don't think he was funny in terms of 70.
I thought, wow, you want to watch it. But also, what was Kennedy's program called? And what the only success that we had in it was what? And to stop the brain drain, what was built? Yeah, so we always come back to West Berlin. Did we quit right here?
No.
Oh, we quit right deterrence, right?
Yeah.
So both sides, both Castro, who felt very vulnerable because the United States was going through a big defense buildup. And do we even show this cartoon though?
Yes.
I think that's a really clever cartoon. And that comes back to the Eisenhower, or not the Eisenhower, so the Einstein quote he did after the Soviets exploded their first atomic bomb. And he was asked what the Third World War would look like.
Oh, no.
And he said, I don't know. I don't know what the Third World War, but the next one will be followed with sticks and stones. So if it's mutually assured destruction. And so both Khrushchev and Castro feel weak. And so, yeah.
Why is it a Z and Y?
They just made up stuff. Okay, H bomb, so they just figure the next generation of bombs will be the Z bomb. You know, that kind of stuff. So the Cuban Missile Crisis would be as close as the world would know to coming to nuclear war. In fact, arguably as close as you could imagine. 79 people didn't know about how close that was, fortunately. And this is a great cartoon. So here's those Khrushchev and Kennedy and arm wrestling, the Cold War. But you notice both fingers on the button. So Kennedy's is Khrushchev is sitting on that, and vice versa. But what makes it such a good cartoon, why I like it so much, is they're arm wrestling. But let's say Kennedy wins, right? What does he hit? Yeah, he hits his own button if he wins. Khrushchev does the same, meaning who wins nuclear war? No one. It's a pretty clever cartoon. I like that one.
Wait, if Kennedy wins, then do we opposite? If Kennedy wins, goes this way, and goes not.
Why is Kennedy still
Now, I know what you're saying, right? If an H-bomb goes off,
Oh,
Oh, it's true.
yeah. Kennedy's not going to make it. he's not going to make it. It's not going to be only explode here this way. But I see what you're saying. Yeah. So, October 14th, 1962. So it's 62. I don't know why I didn't put 62 down. A U-2 flying an illegal mission over Cuba. So these are illegal, but they're spy missions. So the U.S. is doing it because they know the Soviets are starting to aid Cuba. Air bases, air defense, and these sites here. And this is a just generic picture for U-2. And on this flight, they discovered that the Soviets were constructing missile sites. Short, medium, and intermediate range missiles. Now these are the sites where they're starting to make, and these wouldn't be silos, so that they would just basically have an erector that the missile would stand up, they'd fuel it and fire. But under these tents, they were very sure were missiles. And the thing was, this is only 90 miles from the shores of the United States. And this set the Kennedy administration to an absolute panic. Because after the Berlin Wall, you can imagine they're already on edge. And does this look like that Khrushchev wants closer for a preemptive strike? Because look at this map that the CIA would make. But it's pretty close to accurate. Short, medium, intermediate range missiles. So they could reach virtually every major city in the United States and Canada, including, I mean, you can see it right here. What can they hit? Wyoming is vulnerable now. And so, look at that. Launch from Havana. How fast or how much warning would there be before a missile hit Washington, D.C.? Less than about a 5-minute warning. That'd be it. 5 minutes. Yeah.
Is that why they put the missile silos in Great Falls so it'd be the longest to get out there?
No, they did it because it's dry. They have solid fuel. Solid fuel degenerates in humid climate. That's why I said. So that's what Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming. So North Dakota has a bunch too. And so with that, the big issue for this though is this is what you have to get down. This is a political crisis for Canada. It's a political crisis. Politically, could you imagine how the Republicans would bash him in '64? You allowed Soviet missiles here. Well, that would make the missile gap and the bomber gap look tame. And Kennedy knew politically no American president could allow that. Now, the irony of this is the US had missiles in Japan, also missiles right here in Turkey and in Italy that could reach most parts of the Soviet Union within minutes. So the US was already doing it to them, but the US could not allow that. That's part of the reason why Castro felt so afraid. Now, we did have those first Minuteman missiles literally just went operational before this happened, near Great Falls, the first 50. Kennedy called it his ace in the hole. So, poker terms, you know, playing some cards done. Okay, so Kennedy created an executive committee that they abbreviated, this is the government, they abbreviate everything, EXCOM. And these are all his leading foreign policy advisors. And this is in the conference room outside of the Oval Office. And here's Kennedy meeting with the Joint Staff. Remember, Joint Chiefs of Staff, remember that Curtis LeMay we mentioned before? That's him right there, who's saying from day one, we should just go full-on nuclear war. We have more weapons, let's do it now. And so that was kind of advice Kennedy was getting. By the way, remember the rocking chair I told you about? We know what happened in these committee meetings because Kennedy had this bug. He had microphones in there and they were taping all the conversations. Almost every, well, in fact, every president since Roosevelt had been doing this. Some way, like LBJ would record all his phone conversations. And Richard Nixon would have a voice-activated microphone in the Oval Office. And the whole idea was, let's say somebody came in and said something to the president, and then went out publicly and said something else, you had him on tape. So that would catch him. Now, this might have a little issue down the road. This is what we call foreshadowing. What am I foreshadowing? Watergate, yeah. So, we know a lot what happened in these meetings here, and it turned out that most of the advisors desperately wanted war. And Kennedy comes off very good. He misunderstood why the Russians built it, but he comes across very positively. In fact, I could argue that he maybe kind of saved the world. Now, I will tell you a few stories about this after the exam. Because there's something, you know, they don't really fit to them. They aren't that important, but they're just amazing stories what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I'll take a day or so and tell you a bunch of stories that don't quite fit in for that. But Kennedy had 4 basic options. 3 of them, he turned them all down. The first one was diplomacy. Soviet Foreign Minister Alexander Gromyko, right there, Gromyko was in DC just a couple days after they discovered the missiles. That would have been a perfect time to do some secret diplomacy to get the Soviets to pull them out. To convince Khrushchev how crazy it was to threaten the United States this way. How the Red Scare had made the Americans crazy. But Kennedy decided diplomacy was weak. If it failed, he looked weak. And Kennedy wanted to look strong politically. He wanted a standoff, which, by the way, is kind of scary, though. The standoff might end the world. Then he probably wouldn't be reelected. Just throwing that out there, logic. So, LeMay and the Air Force and the Navy said we could do it. They called it a surgical airstrike. We'll put bombs right on those missile sites before they're operational and stop the threat right there. The problem was they probably couldn't have hit something that small then. And that probably would have escalated to number 3, all-out invasion, just take it. And that's what a lot of the generals were pushing for. They started moving troops down to Florida and Louisiana, and those are Marines practicing for an invasion, but let's invade. The problem with these two, it will almost certainly escalate. In fact, it would turn out to escalate much more than they thought it would. And what they were thinking is, in fact, Kennedy's first thought, wait a second, if we attack Cuba, what city is vulnerable that the Soviets could immediately threaten? What city? There's not a city called Wyoming. Berlin. West Berlin. Immediately, where they get West Berlin? West Berlin. Next thing you know, we'll have to defend, we'll turn into war, boom, the escalation goes to thermonuclear war. So, they decided to do a blockade. But because blockades are an act of war, they called it a quarantine. Yeah, they just. And the thought was originally 200, then eventually a 100-mile line to stop Soviet ships. Basically saying to the Soviets, we're not going to allow you to bring any more supplies in. pull the missiles out. But the problem is, what if they cross the blockade line? Then escalation and war. So this is pretty dangerous. And here's an American patrol plane flying over a Soviet freighter. So the thing about it is, if it's a quarantine, it's got to go public. Everyone's got to know. So October 22nd, 1963, Kennedy went on national television and announced to the world that the Soviets had missiles and the United States was going to blockade or quarantine. And everybody knows that could be the first step to World War III. Overnight, you could imagine how people, especially in the West, so the US, Western Europe, and like Japan, US, Canada, I mean, war is coming. And people began to literally set up makeshift bomb shelters in the basement, start stockpiling food. Cities did alerts, basically saying, know where your fallout shelter is, and the next time you hear a siren, it's the real thing. And people really thought it was over. Yeah.
So this all started on the 14th when the YouTube flew over, and then he announced it on the 22nd.
Yeah.
Did they start when he announced it? Is that when they started, or was it already?
It did not. The blockade did not start till then, but that gave them a couple days to get ships out there to stop. And they were already. Then they could track Soviet ships coming in. And so there are going to be a bunch of events that are going to happen in this time. But the only thing we really need to know is, well, because we got to narrow it down. On the 24th, the first Soviet ships arrived at that blockade line. And this shows them carrying probably a torpedo or small patrol boats, but they knew there were also Soviet ships that were carrying missile components. And these Soviet ships were going full speed at the 100-mile line. American ships were there, there's submarines, American and Soviet submarines under the water, and it really looked like they might have to fire upon them, and this would escalate very quickly to World War III. And this was kind of, oh God, did we go too far? What's going to happen? And at literally the last minute, the Soviet ships hit a full stop and went to drift on approximately that 100-mile line. And what that meant was diplomacy might be possible. And they began the steps of secret diplomacy. That is really, I think, what Khrushchev realized. It's hard to tell. It was there a couple days earlier that, wow, did I make a mistake? The Americans would react with such fury, and they had so many weapons, this could destroy the world. Little did we know until 25 years later that there was a Soviet submarine that was escorting those lead ships, was under the water, and so they're out of radio contact. And they thought American ships above had attacked them, and the Soviet captain actually ordered his ships to fire a torpedo. And the executive officer literally had, the story was, had his thumb rested like this and hit the button that would tell the torpedo room to fire. And the political officer came in screaming, wait. And so the executive officer, second in command, didn't do it. And cooler heads prevailed. That torpedo was nuclear tipped. And if that would have fired and exploded, it would have escalated like that in World War III. And most of us here, I guess, wouldn't have known it. No. So it's really scary. And then 2 days later, even more things happen. And that, I'll tell you what happened on the 26th. You won't believe what happened on the 26th. That was a day, it's like, we're here. It's unreal. So, secret negotiations began, and finally on October 28th, in fact, that was the deadline, noon, or the U.S. was going to attack. October 28th, Khrushchev agreed to basic terms. The terms were, the U.S., I don't know why I capitalized the not, but I wanted to. The U.S. would not invade Cuba, and the Soviets would remove the missiles. And the only way they could communicate, because there's no direct line between the Kremlin and the White House, is Khrushchev had to record a speech and then broadcast it on Radio Moscow. And U.S. and Western listening stations could pick it up, decipher it. There was no direct communication, which is a pretty scary way to do it. But in secret, the United States secretly agreed, they didn't want this public, to remove those missiles in Turkey and Italy. Now, they were obsolete. The U.S. was going to remove them anyways, but they didn't want to look like extortion. Now, the crisis had been resolved, and I'll tell you a couple stories about what happened afterwards, even though it took a long time for people to calm down. And It was resolved. Things did look a little bit better, but opponents of Kennedy are going to say he gave in. This is appeasement. This was another, what city? Munich. Just like Munich. And this actually stung Kennedy, which will make him, in a way, want to be tougher on communism someplace else. Both sides realized that they gave him the brink. Let's lock this thing for a while. I like this cartoon, actually. I think that's pretty clever. Two big agreements will come up between the United States and the Soviet Union to lessen tensions. A limited test ban, no more open atmospheric nuclear tests. They would still test underground to the 1980s, but no more open atmospheric tests. And a hotline, a direct line connecting the Kremlin and the White House to avoid situations like that so they could talk. Actually, not talk. When I was hear about remembering about the hotline, you hear about this during the Cold War, I always envision like this movie poster has, a red line, they always call it, where they just pick up the phone and talk to the Kremlin. It was actually a telegraph line. Because the thought was, in case of nuclear war or some kind of accident, telegraph line would be more secure. The electromagnetic waves of the nuclear bomb would knock out all communication and electricity. Yeah.
I'm not sure it's not that hard.
Yeah. I'll explain that.
I literally look at it every day.
Yeah. That's arms around the Russian premier. I will explain that.
Okay, I thought that when President's first day.
It's someone like this around it, a woman around. And now it goes, it's one of the greatest movies, I consider one of the greatest movies, and considered one of the two or three greatest comedies ever made. And it's about the Cold War. It's a satire. And I've shown that the last few years, the last thing in class with you. So I'll tell a little bit more and explain that. But it relates to this. It's so good.
Is it your favorite food?
It's one of them, yeah.
What's your favorite food?
God, there's so many great ones. I would say the invasion of the 50-foot woman. Okay, so Khrushchev, though, is a really bad beat from 1950. So Khrushchev, though, was actually, there's actually a movie that it's so bad it's unreal. So Khrushchev, that's why I like it. He, though, felt humiliated. And hardliners within the Soviet Union said, never again will the Soviets back down. And Khrushchev will be ousted from power the next year, 1964. He was not assassinated, which is kind of amazing if you think about it. But he would be replaced with hardliners who wanted to get tough in their arms race. Eventually, Leonid Brezhnev would come on top. And so most of my memory of the Cold War, and thinking of the Soviets, was this man's face. Those eyebrows haunted me at night. By the way, do you want to guess the Soviets like medals? Yeah. But what Brezhnev did, these new hardliners, to never be humiliated again, they began to dramatically increase the production of atomic weapons. More bombs and as many missiles as possible. So this is their May 1st parade in this, which is today. These are surface-to-air missiles, nuclear tipped to knock down planes. And that is a Satan rocket with a 20 megaton warhead that could hit any place in the United States. Now, a couple big things are going to come out of this. They're never going to be allowed to be humiliated, but 50% of their entire economy by the end of the decade will be geared towards weapons. That means who's missing out? There's going to be food shortages, clothing shortages, housing shortages. So this is what we got to get. This massive arms race would begin to destroy the Soviet economy by the 1970s. They'd be in free fall and total collapse by the early 1980s. Now, much of this was hidden to the public outside of the Soviet Union. They knew how bad things were, but people did not realize until it literally just fell apart. So you can argue the beginnings of the end of the Cold War was here, even though the Soviet system was bound to collapse anyways. And one more thing about it, remember the space race and the goal to get to the moon? With the Soviets committing 50% of the resources to make nuclear weapons and ICBMs, they didn't have enough to go to the moon. By the mid-1960s, their scaled-down project would have a series of accidents, and what we have to get is this. They'd abandoned the moon. The Americans did not know this. You know, they still kept sending men up into space in satellites, but they pretty much abandoned going to the moon. So the U.S. would win that race, but we know what really happened. And when would the first human land on the moon?
69.
Yeah, 1969. Or in this, where was it actually?
Arizona.
Soundstage in Arizona. We all know that's true, correct? Okay, so look how many warheads. These are just strategic. Both sides had over 40,000 tactical nuclear warheads too. These are the big warheads for bombers and missiles. Look how many warheads they have. The US peak would be early 60s. The Soviet peak would be in the early 1980s. 400 medium-sized nuclear warheads. Medium's about 100 kilotons, which is about 10 times bigger than the Hiroshima bomb. If they exploded around the world, would end all life on the Earth. 400. How many times can we destroy the world with just those? And that's not counting the tactical weapons like on torpedoes and surface-to-air missiles and on aircraft carriers. So it's actually pretty amazing. Yes, most of the weapons go, but this is kind of a big deal. How do you get rid of a bomb? You can't explode it. They take the plutonium ball out, put it in one place, and they take the explosives, put it someplace else. So what do they have to do to get the bomb back together? Boom, bomb. By the way, when the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of these plutonium ball, we know about that. Uh-oh. Do you know where they're at? Nope. You kept that secret? And then it's all in this row. So, with that, everybody, I forgot to put this down. Write down the movement. The movement will be the name given to the civil rights movement, the fight for equal rights for men. The fight was going on, and a couple things we have to get to. The Southern Christian Leadership Council would be, we work with the NAACP and other groups, but this was the group that Martin Luther King was the head of, even though he was one of many people running it. They began a series of sit-ins to fight against Jim Crow laws. And this is a classic example of civil disobedience. To go into segregated restaurants. Here is a Woolworths, which was a general store, but also had a lunch counter in it. And young, very brave, black and white people would come together and sit and demand to be waited upon. And they would not leave the sit-in until they were served. And they had to face being humiliated, or I'm sorry, being jeered at, humiliated. Here you see they're dumping their drinks on their head. Or physical assault to try, well, think about this, that civil disobedience, to show how unjust these laws were. If this is a morality play, who looks like they're standing up for justice for humans and who looks like they're tyrants? And so this set up that play, which, by the way, to take that, you have to be incredibly brave. Because if they would have wheeled around and fought back, that would have been given an excuse to come in and arrest them, rough them up, and put them away because they're just violent. But this, to take it, is a hell of a lot harder than to fight back. A lot harder. Because you know the outcome, what's good of that might never happen. If it does happen, it'll happen a long time down the road. And one more thing about this. The argument that's still used today against this kind of thing was that, let's say you own this Woolworths. And the argument is, hey, I own this store. I don't have to serve anybody I don't want to serve. And there is an element of truth to that, but this is different. This is a law to ban somebody, not anything they ever did, but ban them from participating in the normal activities of a commercial society. And that's what we got to get down. What they're fighting is to participate, got to get this down, to participate equally in the market. In the market. Commercial activity is important, in fact, necessary to participate in the market. And if people don't have equal access to the marketplace, commercial activity to start a business and buy and sell goods, which they can't do in a segregated society, and sitting at a lunch counter is a very easy example to see that, then by definition, you are treating them unequally. In fact, that violates the 14th Amendment. And here's the other thing. Why can the federal government come in and say you got to serve them? And that's in North Carolina. It's this. This is what you got to get down. The federal government regulates commerce. How do they regulate it? They set the laws up. They enforce laws to protect it. And there's something else they do. Where do you think that stuff that people spend comes from? Money is created by the federal government. So the government has that authority to say that everybody can participate in the market. And if some people aren't allowed to participate in the market, you are treating them as second-class citizens and assuring that they will be behind socially, economically, and politically. This lunch counter is in the Smithsonian Museum of American History now. That very lunch counter right there.
Have you seen it?
Yeah, Smithsonian Museum is
Which one's your favorite?
oh, no, I don't know. Aaron's face is always friends. But I like them all. So the Congress of Racial Equality would be another group that would begin what's called another way to attack segregation, the Freedom Riders. And what they would do is they would take buses and integrate buses and ride through the South to challenge, remember Plessy versus Ferguson? And force, basically hoping to get a court case that they can make this federal. And the reason they took buses, this is really important, crossing state lines, that's interstate commerce. That is how they plan to attack this to get a court case. Remember interstate commerce, we've talked about that a lot. The federal government can regulate that. That goes back to that wonderful court case that's on your review list, McCulloch versus Maryland on page 4. I made that up, I have no idea what it is, but I know it's on there. And they knew that they're going to risk arrest, beating, and murder, as a few were lynched. Most famously, it says it right here, right outside of Birmingham, Alabama. There we go. That bus, and that shows people hanging out, or this idea of an integrated bus, and they would be stopped by the state police, Alabama's equivalent to the Highway Patrol. And somebody, it could have even been a policeman, firebombed it while they were still on it. Many of them escaped, but you see the burnt out Hulk. And then the riders were arrested for creating a riot. And the police beat the hell out of them with their nightsticks. Basically say, don't come back again. So you notice what he's picking a tooth out that got knocked out. This man right here is John Lewis. And John Lewis, see that right there? Just got shattered by a nightstick. He's in Congress today. He's a congressman from Georgia. And pretty amazing man for many reasons, but it's still, you can still tell. And when he talks, he has a little bit, kind of a lisp because of that shattered jaw that never healed 100%. He was a tireless fighter in Corps and a group called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
So he's pretty old now.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly, it's almost 81 or 82.
And he's still in the
U.S. Hospital from Georgia. No, man, no, he's got to be in the late 70s. A pretty amazing guy, but also showed that, there's always fits and jumps about equality, but it showed how things have changed. And so with that, and there'll be other events, obviously there's so many things to cover on this, but Alabama would be kind of the center of the anti-equal rights phase. And the governor of Alabama was a man named George Wallace, who fought against integration with every tool he had. And the big one was school integration. And you don't need to write this part, but I just didn't want to forget to say it. That's what I typed it in. But he said that he would stand at the schoolhouse door to keep blacks out of white schools. And that's what he's doing right here. This is George Wallace, and he's standing in a doorway of the admissions office at the University of Alabama to keep black students out. And look at his inaugural address to become governor of Alabama. If there's any doubt where he stands for. Remember Orville Faubus was the governor of Arkansas during the Little Rock Central High. And Faubus got elected to 8 more 2-year terms as governor. And Wallace would become incredibly popular, especially amongst whites, but also amongst more far-right, conservative segregationists all over the country. And this is also important too, because here is Kennedy's Assistant Secretary of State, John Katzenbach. And he is there, he would become LBJ's, not Secretary, I'm sorry, Attorney General. He'd become LBJ's Attorney General. And Kennedy sent federal marshals and the Justice Department to force them to follow court orders. So Kennedy is firmly on the side of civil rights, yet remember we mentioned before, no Civil Rights Act could pass. And so this set the stage for, well, more protests against integration. And once again, in Alabama, what a state. Birmingham, Alabama, there would be marches for integration against segregation. Not only schools, but also businesses. This is in 63. So this is the summer of 63. And their police chief, a guy named Bull Connor, not only did he have firemen come out and shoot fire hoses into him, which if you've ever been hit by a fire hose, has anyone ever happened to you? You've been around that? It's hurt. Yeah, it's good. It's a pleasant little feel against your skin. It'll rip your skin apart if you're close enough to it. So this is a torture. And 6 attack dogs on them. And this one is an amazing picture. They pulled this marcher out just at the moment. See, the dog is biting. Just at that moment. And once again, who are the tyrants? Who's standing for justice? But the issue is, this is relatively simple to see good and evil. What if you get to areas where there is economic inequalities, but there's no real clear laws? There's racism and segregation, but there's not Jim Crow laws. When you get to this in the North, then it will become much more complex, which is something that Martin Luther King knew. And part of the reason why he wanted to push Kennedy, because all of these seem to highlight the failure of the new frontier. Sure, save the world after 1962, but people forgot. We have Vietnam, which we'll get to in a second. We have civil rights bills not passing, protests in the streets. So here's a couple more shots. This is another one of that lunch counter, a different one. Here is another one of the, just after the firebombing. And this is Martin Luther King placing the cross for one of 4 girls who were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in Birmingham, Alabama with a bomb. And here's the thing. Kennedy was personally very popular, but his approval rating was tanking by the going into the fall, into the summer of 1963, which people forget because what's going to happen in November of 63. So with that, but the civil rights movement is saying, we got to push, these new frontier laws wanted civil rights, we got to push it. And this would all lead directly to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And this was organized not only by the SCLC, but also by the United Auto Workers and other unions. And this was to demand not just political equality, but you have to get this down for this, economic justice. We have to do something about the vast inequalities of wealth between working people and the wealthy, which was not near as big then, but also the gap was even bigger between blacks and whites. Not quite as big as the gap is today, but very big. I'll tell you about the gap today. It's actually a start. So this march will be given. 16 speakers will come, over hundreds of thousands of people will come. That's a great picture. Looking back towards the Lincoln Memorial, or looking from the Lincoln Memorial. The World War II Memorial had not been built yet, but it would be right here. And so, you know, the Capitol's behind, the White House is just right there. And Kennedy begged the leaders of this. He called Walter Reuther, the head of the United Auto Workers, and Martin Luther King, and begged them not to do this. Because Kennedy said, it'll make me look weak, and I might lose for re-election. But here's the thing. Change does not happen. Those in power will never change unless they're pushed. And this is King and Walter Reuther saying we have to push. By the way, Walter Reuther, remember that little scene a little bit about, I showed you about the job at Ford, and that one worker I showed you about, that's his brother. Victor Reuther was there too, the brother was the head. So, King will give a speech emphasizing economic justice, which he knew would be messy. But here's a little bit of the speech that King gave at the end. And the reason I'm playing this is because this is what King did his shtick. You know what I mean by shtick? Something he kind of did at every speech. He knew it'd be a good applause line to finish. And everybody went with him and heard it 1,000 times. It's stirring words, but it's basically this idealized version. After it went through, there's going to have to be real movement to raise wages and to get rid of economic inequality. So he went through this, then finished with this. And everybody talks about this part, and it's hard actually to find a recording of little bits of the other part of the speech. But let's go ahead and watch just a little bit of this, and let's see if I can make this work. And this video is actually really
August 28, 1960, text, and shared with the protesters his dream of equal rights for all.
Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Now, seems very benign. That is your stick. That is what people play all the time. The two funny things about that one is, first off, the guy, all the men, and mostly men, this is 1963, who were with him, with King, heard many of his speeches, they're all going, oh, geez, not this again. He's doing it again. They were kind of laughing at that part because they'd heard it so many times. But the other part is this hides the rest of the speech. This hides where he talked about economic justice. And economic justice is not just simply saying, hey, let's all come together and be friends now and the problem is solved. It means that some people are desperately behind others because of years of racism. And people looking back will play that bit and say, see, all King wanted was people to come together. Well, that's not the way many people saw it then. Here is a poll, and it shows the conservative backlash was already growing. Look at the percentage of the population that heard that speech and thought it was, in fact, that march, and thought it was bad. The vast majority of whites in 1963 thought this was going too far, nothing's really wrong, or I don't want to give up what I have. And so people looking back today, it's actually amazing that people talk about what King really wanted. Oh God, whites were afraid of this. And so this means a real change in status. I should add, King was what we call basically a social democrat or democratic socialist. He was pretty close, very pro-union, close a little bit like what the Fair Deal and the New Deal wanted. Very pro-union. While this is going on, fun and games in South Vietnam. South Vietnam, the Civil War was going very badly for the South Vietnamese. Remember, what was the name of the Viet Cong? We're also called the what? The Vietnam was the other, was just for get the French out. There are people moving their mouth, but they're not national. The National Liberation Front. And let's say we have a question on the Vietnam War. You think there'll be a question? Did you say that?
Yeah.
I missed it. I'm sorry. I didn't hear it. I blame society. I blame Bryce. So, the National Liberation Front. And so the thing about the National Liberation Front was this. They were mostly Southerners. They were fighting against South Vietnam. They won Vietnam. And by 62, 63, they're winning. The South Vietnamese army is on the run. North is resupplying him in a series of trails that we lumped together called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The U.S. called it that. They didn't call it that. Trails through neutral Laos and Cambodia. Yes, eventually Cambodia will be drawn in to not only the war, but eventually genocide. That's another story. But Kennedy, after weakness in so many different areas, felt the United States has to commit more to South Vietnam to get them to survive. And so, these are the main reasons Kennedy began to commit eventually over 16,000 advisors, including Green Berets and helicopter and air and bomber pilots, to the conflict in South Vietnam. The first one we know about the domino theory, right? We know what that is. But also, we got to show we'll defend our friends. We're going to prove to Berlin and Western Europe that our word is gold. We will defend you by defending South Vietnam. Next, with civil rights, we just had the March on Washington, but all the fight for civil rights and this bill stalled. Kennedy felt pushed that he had to show some kind of victory somewhere, and he wanted to get reelected. Had to be tough on communism. That's why I have the reelection sign there. Kennedy felt pushed. He's getting into it. But what's missing from that reason? I think all of you should see it very quickly. Yeah, South Vietnam was not the reason we committed to that civil war. It was all domestic politics and Cold War politics. It had nothing to do with South Vietnam. Do you see a problem there? Really hard to keep motivated to fight and die in South Vietnam if you don't care about South Vietnam. But I should tell you about our attitude towards the people there, which is going to be bad. So with that, yeah.
Is that kind of one of the reasons that you think we lost?
Yeah, we're kind of doomed always, but that would definitely hurt. Because it's never going to be a full commitment. You know, it was always, we just want to assure there's two Vietnams for the Cold War. So that will always limit the amount that will, yeah. And not just the government and the army, but the people of the United States. Nguyen was, or Zim was the dictator, we mentioned it before. He was corrupt. There were protests in the street against Zim. He had nepotism, giving family members jobs. And the fight in the street would grow even bigger for Zim when in 1963, Buddhist monks in the middle of protests began to cover themselves with gasoline and light themselves on fire to protest how awful the Zim administration was. And so horrific pictures like this, and this one's the most famous of them, the men burning them alive because of their hatred of the corruption of Zim. Does this look like we're doing well in South Vietnam? So when generals came to the United States, South Vietnamese generals that fall and said, we want to overthrow Zim, Kennedy reluctantly agreed that they would overthrow Zim. We thought, okay, we'll get rid of this bad leader. But it fell apart immediately. He was brutally murdered. This picture, I'm glad it's in black and white. See him bound up and they beat him to death and then shot him. Basically beat him to near death and then shot him. And then, even though the U.S. didn't do it, everybody thought the U.S. was responsible. And the bad part is, this is one of the first General Min. The U.S. then will be stuck with a whole series of military dictatorships that look like the United States had no choice but to. The same thing will happen in Afghanistan right now. But I should add one more thing. We don't know what would happen. Everyone just look up here real quick. Because a month and a half after this, Kennedy was assassinated. All righty then, on that happy note, I will see you tomorrow. Who's coming first period again? Raise your hand. Like I said, I'll be here at 4 a.m. to open the doors. I'll be around then. Right tonight. Yeah. I'm just going to where. Yeah. I can really say that you're on my own. Okay, you come down and have a view. Oh, really? Wow. So he was oh, yeah. Oh, what? Was he an engineer? Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Was he in Texas?
He traveled.
Yeah, that's a great one. Where did that go?
Us, yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, they did a lot of the, especially for the lamb, the eagles. They did a lot of that work in Seattle. Yeah, that makes great sense. That's really cool. That's really awesome.
Yeah.
It's kind of where you find out, little brushes with.
Oh, yeah. That's. Oh.
I'm really proud of part of the.
I said, Justin, for the hallway.
All right, we got to get going. Take out the worksheet.
Hey, look at that.
Everything should be very straightforward, not confusing at all. They don't throw things at you rapid fire. Yes.
Those are actually. All right. So this, we're not going to take care of this, and then. Everything else. It was like three of us. What do we like?
I have to check my phone because there's a rumor. I'm waiting for a text.
What is the room?
That McCartney might be playing at Red Rock. Now, wait a second. That's actually a really good point. Does he look like somebody who's scared to death that he's been arrested, or somebody who thought, I just got away with something, aren't I cool? Yeah. Gary Oldham, I think it is. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, he does look like him. And that's why when they'll show flashes and they'll show Bill and they put him into it, they go back and forth. By the way, David Ferry is now gone, so the quotient of swearing will go down dramatically.